Greetings and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of our Industry Insights seminar series. I'll just take a minute here to explain a little bit about what that is, and then we'll roll right into the program. My name is Michael Alvarez. I'm the director of the School of Medicine Career Center here at Stanford. The three-branch curriculum includes Careers in Science, which is an opportunity to hear directly from Ph.D. researchers, former postdocs that are doing a variety of things professionally, and you can get greater information on the functional roles that they're performing in different settings, in the legal professions or in the legal arena, banking, finance, pharma, biotech, that sort of thing. We also have a professional development skills track, which has to do with negotiation tactics, interviewing preparation, how to prepare your credentials and applications for different types of jobs and things that you might like to be doing when you're through with your training here. And then, of course, today, Industry Insights. This one today will be on science and the media. This is a means of providing visibility into the inner workings of some of the fields that are adjacent to research, or places where science intersects, whether that be in med device, product development, and commercialization. We had a program on that. Different areas where folks are working in the healthcare sector, a wide range of programs. So we're glad that you're here today, and we're delighted to have someone who is regarded very highly in the scientific community as well as in politics through his various roles throughout his career. Don Kennedy was the president here at Stanford for quite a stretch, for about, I think it was 12 or 13 years. And he was the commissioner of the United States Food and Drug Administration for a time, and has been the editor-in-chief at Science Magazine for a number of years as well. And so we're delighted to have him here. I'd like to thank him on two counts. One, for his role in delivering the program today, but also as an advisor for the development of the Career Center. I'd like to make it known that he has contributed significantly throughout the last 18 months as we've gotten the center up and running. So on those counts, I'd like to thank him. And as for the format today, Don will have a presentation that he'll roll through, and then we'll have some Q&A, and I'll finish up with some remarks, mostly a reminder to fill out the survey, and also a statement of what's coming next week as far as Industry Insights programs. So with that, I'll hand things over to Don, literally. Pardon me? The slides? There are no slides today.
I told him the only thing I know how to run is my mouth. I was carefully instructed where to put this. Close. There we go. I want to talk to you about some issues in science publishing, but from several different points of view. It's a process in which you are all fated to engage in one way or another, as author, as reviewer, as appreciative reader. Science publishing and news about science is a large and complex venture altogether. And as potential authors, all of you are an important part of that process. And by way of helping you think about that, I think it's useful to remind everybody that there is no silent experiment. That is, there is no experiment that's done in secret that nobody ever hears about. It's only done when other people know about it, and the way they know about it is through publication. And so it really helps, while you're thinking about the experiment, doing the work, to be thinking about communicating it at the same time. Because if you wait until it's done, and then you try to weave your way back through the process of creating the design and then doing the work, it won't come out nearly as well as if you've been thinking about how you tell the story all the time that you're building the story. Later, you'll have lots of journals to choose from, and I want to talk about that for a little while. And it may surprise you that you won't hear from me a big pitch for publishing in Science, although we'll obviously be glad to take a look at your work. Let me tell you a little bit about the magazine I've been editor-in-chief of for 6 years now. It has a circulation of about 140,000, and recipients of the magazine are automatically, either because they want it or because they like other things about the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the world's largest scientific society, they are both members and subscribers. Many of you almost certainly read Science magazine online, and the reason that you have to go online to get it is either because you can't stand to wait for the print copy in the mail, or more likely because you grew up reading stuff on BDTs and you can stand it. I can't, but I'm quite a lot older than anybody else in the room. So let me tell you a little bit more about Science. The work of receiving and editing and arranging peer review for manuscripts is done by about 24 editors, and I want to tell you a little bit about them because they're like you. They got Ph.D.s, they had postdoctoral fellowships, all of them. Very few of them actually went right into academia, and then later, for example, when failing to get tenure, came to Science. We are not a refuge for the disappointed. These are folks who chose it, and I'll tell you one explanation I got for why they chose it. The newest editor we have is a terrific young guy, a chemist. One of my colleagues on the AAAS board, when I told this colleague, he's an old friend, about Jake, he said, "Boy, what a resume," and he sort of asked, "What's a guy like that doing at Science?" And I was really offended by that question, and so I went and asked Jake, and he said, he had a summa from Harvard, he had done his Ph.D. with Brad Moore at Berkeley, he'd worked at NIST, he had a nice elegant, short, but sweet list of publications. And I said, "How come?" And he said, "I thought really hard about it, and I discovered that I liked science even more than research." When you think about your own career, that's a kind of juxtaposition to contemplate and say, is that a way I could feel, or does it simply sound silly? I did want to share it with you because I think it's a way of getting inside your own feelings about what gets you excited, what churns your creativity up, what warms your circuits, and so forth. Science magazine gets about 12,000 submissions a year, and we publish about 8% of them. Very often, we are found telling prospective authors that their work is terrific and that it might be more suitable for a more specialized journal. They think we're being polite. We're not. We really admire the work, and we think that there are certain kinds of papers that are more suitable for a specialized journal than they are for us. We have fairly stringent space limits. We edit papers down to those space limits, and sometimes authors go when that's happening. We cover all of the sciences, not just the life sciences, and as a consequence, we have to allocate our page resources to represent a number of disciplines in a way that's fair. So it's a difficult place to get published. But why it is that apparently, tenure committees and people who love citation indexes and so forth just think that it's a great idea to publish in Science or Nature, our competitor known in our shop as Brand X. It appears that people think that this carries a particular cachet, and I want to speak a short piece in favor of the more specialized journals. The space limitation is not nearly as severe. Many of them are superbly reviewed and selective, and I don't think the tenure committee that looks hard at Science and Nature papers and ignores or gives less weight to more specialized journals, I think they're making a mistake. And I think in some sense we're regarded as too important in the world outside. So let me stop there about science, but remind you that the research, the reports, the research articles in the back of the magazine aren't the only part of the magazine. We have in most weeks 17 or 18 pages of news, and the news is written by science journalists who have trained both in the sciences and in journalism, usually in specialized programs, one of the best of which, interestingly, is about 20 miles from here at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where a small shop has produced a remarkable record at turning out really excellent people. Our journalists who publish science news in the front of the magazine often graduate to go other places. In fact, 3 of our former people writing for science are now writing science for the New York Times. And so we see them go reluctantly, but know that their careers are in reasonably good shape. I want to turn now to the back part again, because we send manuscripts through an interesting process. It starts in the following way. The submission's electronic. That gives us a chance to send it right out to an appropriate pair or 3 members of our board of reviewing editors who are in the particular specialty of that paper, and they give us a 24 to 48 hour turnaround judgment as to whether it ought to be sent out for in-depth peer review or not. That's the judgment they make. So there's a threshold parameter of our decision process that is not entirely internal. It is external. That board of reviewing editors has about 120 people on it. And so in most cases, an adverse decision made by science is not made entirely inside. It is made with the intervention of the board of reviewing editors. Next, it goes out for in-depth peer review, and some manuscripts are accompanied by cover letters in which the authors say something like, please don't send it to Smith, Jones, Graham, Buckley, or somebody else. These people are competitors of ours, and they won't treat the paper fairly. Just for a statistic, we did a quick sample in the physical sciences and the biological sciences, and it turns out that the frequency of cover letter blackballs, as it were, is between 30 and 40% in the biological sciences, and it's only 8% in the physical sciences. But the physical sciences have other outlets, which we'll discuss in a moment, that might affect that result. Not everybody is happy about peer review, and I am one of them, because unless you've been asleep on a desert island for the last little while, you will know that we published a very spectacularly fraudulent pair of papers on stem cells from South Korea. And that has provided me with an interesting opportunity. The opportunity has been to answer a large number of reporters who have asked me questions like the following. How come you guys screwed up? Is this the death of peer review? Well, I think we didn't, and I don't think it's the death of peer review. What I've had to try to explain to Jim Lehrer, to Science Friday, to other outlets that seemed willing to listen, is that peer review is not a guarantee of infallibility. Science, Nature, every journal that you know has published a paper that has turned out to be either wrong, that's more common, or fraudulent, that's fortunately a lot less common. Finally, I gave up trying to explain about peer review and why it's a really good system, and asked a reporter, suppose that you imagine that everybody in science believes that publication in a peer review high prestige journal is a guarantee of infallibility. How many people do you suppose would ever repeat an experiment? No incentive. If they believe everything they read, nobody is going to say, you know, that's kind of a counterintuitive result, and I think I'm going to see if I can get it too, or show that it's false. And that's the ultimate test of truth in science. It isn't worth much until somebody else goes out and accomplishes the same thing. I rather suspect that's going to happen in the case of the Korean stem cell business. I think that was an objective that everybody understood was fairly close over the horizon for the person who could do it right. And I think no one will give up, and that it's likely that it will be repeated. But peer review I've said is a good thing, but lots of times I get asked questions about how it might be different. For example, suppose that the authors of papers had their names erased from the paper, and it came to the reviewers blank. You know, the idea is that if you're reviewing a paper by some recent Nobel laureate, the burden of proof ought to be on you to show that it's that it has a problem, not the other way around. In fact, that's been tried in various circumstances. I'll tell you that there are several things that militate against it. One is that for peer reviewers in the same field, many authors have styles that are quite identifiable or distinguishable. There is furthermore the common, though not always approved, practice of self-citation that might be a giveaway for many papers, not all, I hope, but many. It's a serious practical difficulty and an administrative burden. So we have not tried it, although I have published in a journal that in fact does it that way, and fortunately I survived the experience. I would suppose that there are some authors who would welcome perhaps having their name not associated with the paper when it undergoes review, but most would prefer that they were identified. It has also been proposed that the review process ought to be transparent, that somehow the paper goes out online, the reviewer's comments go online, so that both the author and the reviewer know that they're out there and that anybody can look at the evaluation that was given to the manuscript as well as the manuscript itself and make their own judgment. Sometimes it would be a good way of avoiding a complaint that we occasionally get from reviewers. Reviewer A says, gee, I didn't like that paper at all, but you published it anyway. What did reviewer B say? And we preserve the confidentiality of reviewers, so it's a little difficult for us to deal with that, although we generally let them know what happened, although not the specific evaluations that were given by companion reviewers. I'd be curious to know what you think about an open or transparent process of review. Some feel that candor would be sacrificed if my critique is known in that way. Others feel that transparency and sunlight are such good qualities, and that one ought to discard one's objections and go ahead and do it. I guess I have two pieces of advice to you with respect to preparing a manuscript to go through this process. First, to repeat myself, there are lots of good journals, and don't focus necessarily on the most visible ones or the ones that you think will impress others. There are lots of good journals. When I was in the lab, we had published in both Science and Nature, but I think the longer and in some ways better papers were ones that I did neurobiology, were ones that we published in the Journal of Neurophysiology, which at that time, though no longer, was the very much preferred specialty journal in the neurosciences. Presenting your work, be clear. Isn't that a helpful suggestion? Telling somebody to write clearly is a sort of useless construction, but there's a lot that you can do to improve your writing by writing a lot, by religious attention to the dicta laid out in Strunk and White. How many of you don't know the meaning of Strunk and White? It's a wonderful short piece. Originally a writing course text at Cornell by Professor Strunk and modified for modern writers by E.B. White, a terrific writer himself. And it contains wonderful little snippets of advice for all writers. I used to give it to every Ph.D. student at the time he or she started a thesis. Some read it, others plainly did not. Remember that in most journals where there is an online publication as well as a print publication, you have the luxury of adding supplementary material online, and our authors are now taking very good advantage of that. In fact, we're going to have to rein it in a little bit, because although we like to economize on print space a little bit by encouraging authors to put some of the methods that aren't absolutely essential into supplementary material online, and now some people are complaining that there's too much back and forthing between the text of the paper itself and supplementary material online, and we're probably going to have to re-regulate that subdivision, and that's one of the things that we're thinking about now. Be especially careful about image preparation. We have had a rash of new concerns about the question of image manipulation. Photoshop is everywhere, and it's being used a little excessively in some places. I'm sure no one in this room would be tempted to use it to kind of increase the contrast of particular parts of a gel. Changing exposures when you make a print is okay. Dodging is not. So you do need to think about it, because everybody is watching about images and their authenticity these days. I just thought I'd throw that in. 25% of the cases that have resulted in problems at the Office of Research Integrity. That's the Orwellian-named organization at NIH that worries about such things. 25% of their trouble cases arose as a consequence of suspected image manipulation that turned out to have been image manipulation. An entirely unnecessary admonition to you all. Now I want to turn to something else, because I promised that I would talk about how science is covered in the media. We deal quite a lot with that. We have a press office at AAAS that sends out something called the SciPack, which is a set of understandable, they hope, descriptions of papers published the forthcoming week in Science, and it goes to news editors and other subscribers to help them write stories about science papers. And very often authors in places like this that have a good public affairs and news office will get some public attention that way. Hopefully either embargoed in the week before publication or after publication, because most journals, Science included, operate by what was at first called the Inglefinger Rule, named after a well-known editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who decided at some point that if people were going to hold press conferences to flack their new science paper, and all of the news was going to get out into the media before the publication, so then nobody would be interested in reading the formal publication, he said, we won't take papers in which that has happened. And Science has a similar policy. If a paper, a short account of a paper has been given at a scientific meeting, that's okay. But if the author of the forthcoming paper in Science has had a long interview with a reporter or a press conference explicitly devoted to that paper, and it has been and public attention has been given to it, Science may very well decline to publish it at all. You may be interested in this connection that the physical sciences community does things a little differently. Very often they will publish a paper in an archive. It used to be called the Los Alamos National Laboratory server, the LANL server, but its proprietor moved to Cornell, and it's now called Archive. And Archive has first drafts of publications. They get comments. Often the authors will then publish it in a regular publication, but the point is that that's a very transparent and open way of getting your ideas out. And in response to that fact, Science and Nature have both taken the position that publication on those online servers will still permit publication in Science if the authors want to do it. We essentially had to give up to the physicists and say, okay, you can have it your way. So there are numbers of ways in which news about papers in scientific journals gets out, through the journals themselves, through attention of reporters to embargoed versions of those papers that are circulated as part of things like SciPack and from university news services. And so the next question is, how does science get covered? How well does it get covered? Who does it? And what's happening to that universe of general representation of new scientific findings to the public? Unfortunately, I think the trend is in the wrong direction. A number of metropolitan daily newspapers in fairly large cities in the United States have decided that they can do without a science page. Many of them had the sort of equivalent of Tuesday's New York Times Science Times. That I would guess that 50% of those are gone over the past 6 or 7 years. The publishing industry has not been a terribly healthy industry, and it's had to cut a lot of things, and science is one of the things that has gotten cut. If you had watched the New York Times Tuesday Science Times over the years, as I have, I'm very sure that you would note a shrinkage in the amount of attention given to basic science and an expansion in the amount of attention given to health and medical stuff. And so even within a quite dedicated science-intensive publication, that trend has been obvious. If you confine yourself to the top 3 or so newspapers in the United States, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, coverage of science in general is high quality because it's done by very experienced reporters who have come through some kind of training in science journalism and take science seriously and take their responsibilities to report it well seriously. The New York Times is especially abundantly equipped with 4 or 5, I think, very good science writers, Andy Revkin, Corey Dean, I think of especially. The LA Times, not quite as strong now as when Casey Cole was there, but still quite good. The Post, also reasonably good. So you've got to make a distinction between the quality of coverage science gets from those specialists and the quality it gets in most places from general assignment reporters who are working on other topics as well and who get told by the city desk, go cover this interesting story out of wherever. They are responsible, I think, for one of the worst features of reporting about science that I know of, and that is the tendency to take an issue on which there is a reasonably strong scientific consensus, talk to the scientists who represent that consensus, and then find somebody else on the other side to make it appear as a kind of balanced treatment. I think that's barnyard equity. It's come to be known around science as the 2-card Rolodex problem. Somebody's got one climate change scientist, a real one, who reports on global warming, and then there's Fred Singer and 1 or 2 others who can be counted upon to supply some kind of rejoinder. And the result is that a very strong consensus really gets misrepresented in the way it's actually reported. I don't see many of the elite science writers subject to that sin, but certainly it's a kind of problem brought about by the economics of the newspaper industry these days, and it's unfortunate. I was also asked to talk to you a little bit about the ethics of scientific publishing. I've already said some things about the responsibilities of authors to be faithful to the truth and so forth, and you knew when you got up this morning, and I don't need to remind you. Tell the truth. Don't overclaim its impact. One of the problems that we have with science papers is often that we get a nice result, and it's fine and could stand on its own 2 feet, but a claim is made for it that's a little out there, and our editors have to jump on it, and authors then don't like it. So don't put yourself in that position. Don't overclaim. Many of you will be asked to referee And that's a really important contribution. It's a kind of public service to the scientific community. Good journals could not survive without the voluntary efforts of experts to contribute their knowledge and their judgments to the evaluation of papers. So when that happens to you, exercise your judgment and your obligation seriously. Don't let rivalry influence your judgments. That will be hard. Try to be prompt, because lateness of review is the bane of the system. The following situation often arises, and you may recognize it because it might have happened around you someplace. A paper is sent for in-depth peer review to Professor X. She's very busy at the moment and says to postdoc Y, who is actually rather well qualified on the technical specialty that is an important key to the paper, and passes it to Y, saying, would you mind having a look at this paper and giving me your views about it? Y says, why, yes, Professor, I'd be delighted to if you ask. And how soon do you want it? Oh, a week will be good. And so Y goes back to work and then comes back with a report. Here are three things that obtain in that situation. One, Professor X should have made it clear, if she didn't, that this is an absolutely confidential process. The reviewer is bound by confidentiality in all respects. That paper or its review, in your hands, Y, or that review cannot be shared with anyone else. Okay, we can imagine Y saying. Y might also say one more thing, but would probably not for fear of offending Professor X. What Y might devoutly wish to say is, please don't just paste that into your report and sign your name to it. A reviewer who finds it necessary to consult with a laboratory colleague should, by all means, make use of that judgment and add it as the judgment of Y, but not claim that it came from the originator. The role of review really does carry a very serious bond of confidentiality. We have had the experience of having reviewers of a paper who were negative and who didn't like the fact that the paper was published because they didn't see the positive comments that we got from other referees. There are a lot of split decisions in this business. And in at least one case, a disappointed reviewer went to the newspapers and said, I can't imagine how science could have accepted this paper. I reviewed it and thought it was terrible. And that absolutely handicaps the editor of the journal, because we owe the other reviewers who liked it that same bond of confidentiality that this guy has broken. And we can't open our mouths to the reporter who calls and says, well, so-and-so said that was a terrible paper, and your other referees surely should have known how terrible it was. And you say, that was an odd thing for him to say, and that's about as far as you can go. I've talked long enough here. I wanted to make this more of a conversation, so let me stop and hope that you have some questions about this. Yes?
I have a question about the reviewing process. I never understood what is the incentive for a reviewer to put their heart and soul into writing a good review. I
That is such a good question, we've talked about it a little bit. I think most reviewers are incentivized, if that's a word, by, I hate it, by the knowledge that it is an important role in the system that they're playing, and it's really important to get it right. Now, you can argue that there ought to be more than that. When we were considering radical proposals for the journal, one of the things that we considered was have the reviewing a transparent out there process, so that the reviewer would have not only the incentive to make the review very good, but could then list as an addendum to a bibliography important reviews conducted for scientific journals and actually include them. Some tenure committee might say, well, you know, that's really an important duty that Professor Y has done, and we ought to take it into account. That's about as far as we've gotten, and there were other problems with the process associated with transparency that discouraged us. So somebody may try that, and I'll be interested to see how it works. Maybe it'll even be us. Yeah.
As a follow-on to that, this question came up with myself and some colleagues, and one suggestion put forth was that if someone does put the effort in to give a really good review, then that person would have the privilege of getting their manuscript reviewed by other good reviewers. And if you are a poor reviewer, then your manuscript is reviewed by other poor reviewers.
Well, so we're determined to abuse the good and punish the bad by not bothering them anymore.
Well, no, the bad reviewers will get their manuscript reviewed by other bad reviewers.
Oh, that's vicious. I never thought of that. Let me see. What we do with bad reviewers, and there are some, is just to drop them off the list. We don't let them review again because we don't want that problem. Good reviews really ought to receive some kind of reward, and unfortunately, this is one of those cases in which no good deed goes unpunished, because they get asked more often, taking more time away from their research, their graduate students, and so forth.
The New England Journal publishes a list of people that have reviewed their papers, more than 3 papers per se per year.
That's interesting. Yeah, we might do that.
Once a year, the New England Journal publishes a list of reviewers that have reviewed more than 2 or 3 papers from that year.
New England Journal publishes a list of successful and heavily burdened referees. They publish the ones who've done 3 a year. Some of ours, I'm afraid, we've abused more than that. Yes.
Pointed out characteristics of good science journalists, since there seems to be a failure to communicate science to the public in the U.S. What attributes, other than would you call it Barnyard? I missed the term.
Yeah.
What other attributes make for an effective science journalist or communicating science to the public? And can some of those tools be integrated and taught to scientists so that our journalists are able to better communicate?
I think that's right, and there are a couple of programs that do that, though not in the areas that are most practiced in this center. The Aldo Leopold Fellowship Program for ecologists, environmental biologists, does very good training of scientists in that regard, not only with respect to writing, but also with respect to talking to reporters, including talking to reporters on television. it would not be a bad idea if that program were extended so that more subdisciplines could take advantage of it. But it's the one model that I'm aware of. I think some mentors do a pretty good job of preparing their own fellows and graduate students for that kind of role. But I think there are others who don't care so much about it. There's a little attitude in science that makes some wary of what is called the Carl Sagan effect. This referring to the widely held belief that Carl Sagan's election to the National Academy of Sciences was postponed by a lot of envy about the fact that he did lots of TV and lots of educating the public. I don't think that's a meaningful deterrent now. So I would think that scientists who do a good job of explaining their science ought to be admired for that. But we need to do more teaching. Yeah.
Your example of Professor X and postdoc Y,
Yeah.
is that kind of an accepted process, meaning that when you send a paper out for review from Professor X, that he or she shares that with postdoc and or graduate students, and that is, from my experience, is indicated in the review, return. Is that something that's accepted or desired by publishing?
The question is, with respect to the XY example I used, in which a reviewing task is seconded to a postdoctoral fellow, it's not uncommon. We don't have a rule about it that encourages it or discourages it. We do have the confidentiality rule, so if it is done, it should be done with care taken to protect the confidentiality. But I have seen it used to advantage, so I see no reason why it should be discouraged. But it's a matter of judgment. You don't want to pick the wrong person either. A reviewer who would do that out of laziness, or the Y, the postdoc Y, who wouldn't be as competent as X hopes. So it's a matter when it obviously involves good judgment. It's fine, and we see no reason to discourage it, but no reason to promote it either. That's about where we are. Yeah.
I had a question about when authors prepare a cover letter saying that we would like to exclude such and such person because of conflict of interest. So is that encouraged? Because sometimes when you submit your paper, even on the online process, they'll say that who do you recommend would be good, who do you suggest to the reviewers, anyone that would have conflict of interest. And they actually have separate boxes. And so I'm wondering, do journals actually listen to that letter, or do they send it out anyway using their own judgment?
No. We don't promise to send it out to the author's recommended reviewers, but we often do pick one because it's obviously an appropriate choice, and we try to be pretty religious in observing the don't send to. Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering.
Hey, Chris.
What outlets are there for someone like us, scientists, when they see something in the lay press that might be wrong, as it's trickled down from a good journal to the paper, to the Reader's Digest or whatever? Is there any kind of organization that's out there looking at stuff like that, or is there any outlet for when you see that, what you can do to maybe correct that?
Write a furious letter to the editor of the paper. That's the only way I know to deal with it. There are organizations. A prominent one used to be Scientists Institute for Public Information, that would try to keep track of that. Now there is no formal monitoring body that I know of, so it all falls to us to find stupid scientific errors in reports in newspapers and write the editor and say, why don't you hire somebody who knows a little science? Yes?
So what do you see as the major disadvantage of publishing the review online, or perhaps just a part where the reviewer is asked to write a certain part that will be made public? And have you any data of people who have tested this?
I don't have any data on people who have tested the idea of transparent reviews. Our concern has always been that it might induce a less candid response on the part of the reviewer. The same reason that in general academic promotion committees get letters but don't share them with the candidate. Sometimes redacted letters or extended quotations from letters are shared with the candidate, and that may be good and useful in helping the candidate see how others view his or her work. I don't think there's a disabling objection to doing that, at least part of it, public. We now separate between comments intended for transmittal to the author and comments intended for the editors, and it could be the first category that we make published. Back there.
Yeah. There's a whole world of like celebrity science spokespersons and gotcha journalists and a lot of this second and third level of entertainment news media. Is it possible for a scientist to enter or interface with that world without losing his or her soul?
I'm trying to get a better grip on what you mean. There's certainly, there are scientists who do very interesting and entertaining work on television or on radio. David Suzuki in British Columbia is one who I always thought was politically courageous and admirable and pretty sound scientifically. So I think if it's done well, it can be done without damaging one's reputation. But it's the worst thing of all is to ride on a celebrity reputation and pretend to be a scientist. Michael Crichton comes immediately to mind. Yes.
This is related to the peer review process and some of the flaws with it. But has Science Magazine considered using, say, open forums like blogs on the internet, for example, to get commentary on papers such that the reviews would be ongoing and that there would be a dialogue between people who, for example, might want to repeat experiments?
We have e-debates on Science Online where we often publish comments on papers and responses are invited. I think relatively few people take advantage of that feature. We do encourage scientific differences with papers we've published, and we publish those as technical comments, and the scientists who publish the original paper get to respond, and that appears in almost every issue. We haven't quite seriously considered entering the blogosphere, which we regard as sort of the third circle, but maybe it would be a good idea. There are certainly bloggers who pay a lot of attention to what we do with a particular perspective, particularly on climate science. God, there must be 50 or 100 climate science blogs with some are deniers, others are advocates for global warming. Yeah.
With regards sort of to that issue you were saying about how I guess papers outside the Post and the Times have reporters who maybe perpetuate somewhat false controversy. In terms of, like you said, most people agree with this time, have one stance and then there's another stance. where they find one person who has it as stance. But isn't it somewhat the duty to report that sort of thing? Because, you know, like 500 years ago, the controversy would have been to say that the Earth isn't the center of the universe, when in fact we know now
Sure.
the sun things rotate around the sun. So I'm trying to figure out where does the balance come in perpetuating that there might be another idea versus kind of false controversy.
Yeah, I think those voices have to be heard, and I think it's fine. The objection I have is to the proportionality between the attention given to the consensus and the attention given to the person who has a different view. I think the different view should be heard, but I also think that there should be a responsible journalist will give some idea of where the consensus lies. Yes.
Can you say something about the criteria for who should be an author and who shouldn't be an author? So I'm an engineer, and most of my papers would have like 3 or 4 authors, but I hear about these biology papers with like 25 authors, and it's hard to imagine that all of them really made that big of a contribution that they should be.
The number of authors per paper has gone up dramatically over the past 10 or 20 years, steadily, monotonic increase in the number of authors per paper, similar increase in the number of international collaborations that result in papers in science. So how do you keep straight who did what? And particularly that's a problem when the paper comes under challenge for fraud. Joint and several liability? Well, most people would say, wait a minute, I only did the statistics. Or I only wrote the paper for these guys from South Korea. Just to pick an example at random. We may be evolving toward a situation in which each author states a particular contribution so that the audience will know, at least. I always argued, and I must say I'm being beat down, I always argued that if you have a multiple author paper, the authors share the credit and they share the blame if something goes bad. And I think the degree of specialization has now gone to a level, and interdisciplinary collaboration has now gone to a level where I'm not sure I can sustain that case very well anymore. Yes, in the back.
You made the comment earlier that some of your better papers in your view were published in these more specialized journals where you had a chance to really explain the story a little further. And I was wondering, as someone starting out in publishing, is there a benefit to crafting your paper more towards a more generalized journal that has a larger audience, or really targeting the research to a specialized journal where you can explain it for maybe fewer people reading?
I think the fact, let me share a belief that I think I wouldn't say in a different audience. I think science, although it does have a large circulation and has a large audience, my view of the average reader's habit is that the average reader reads the news, may read a perspective on a paper and the paper in his or her special field, but that your chances of getting a lot of eyeballs on your paper, if it's in science or nature, aren't much better than if you write in a more specialized journal. So I think that advantage may be oversold. Okay? And my colleagues would probably kill me on the spot if they heard me say that. We want your paper anyway. Yes?
How do you determine a fair blend between the disciplines when you're publishing science?
Well, that's an interesting question. We do it by feel. We know that, I mean, some members of our senior editorial board have said, geez, there are 2,000 plant physiologists for every one of those guys who digs around looking for extinct hominid skulls. You give so much attention to hominid paleontology and so little in this. Well, we do pay some respect to the number of people who are active and to the number of hot areas. But we also think that there are some disciplines that, although they don't have a lot of, papers in them don't produce a lot of citations, we want to keep geology and we want to keep some other disciplines that aren't in heavily populated, heavily cited areas. If citation index were the real indicator of a quality of journal, we could manipulate ours in no time by taking mostly biomedical research and human genetics. I mean, that's so easy that it's pointless to worry about citation index. We think it's really silly. Yes?
Do you think doubling the NIH budget has increased the amount it takes to get into a good journal? Do you think it's increased the number of good papers, or do you think it's increased the amount of work, the size of the advance you have to make, or do you think it's just made more good papers generally available?
Well, I have a hard time answering that question. The problem, I mean, the NIH budget has gone up in nominal dollars, been reasonably a little flat in real dollars, and will go down, and fairly dramatically over the next 5 or 8 years in view of shrinkage in the domestic discretionary budget. What that's all going to do to the quality of papers, I don't know. What worries me most is the length of time it takes to sort of get on the ladder of getting NIH support and publishing. The average age of the first grantee, first time in life grantee from the National Institutes of Health is up there around 40. I mean, I consider that adolescent, but still, everybody in the field is saying, God, that's old, and it's a lot older than it should be. So you're up against this phenomenon of very delayed postdoctoral progress toward independence and productivity, and that's the first problem I'd like to see solved, but it's hard to think of a way to solve it. Yes?
I review for a journal that sends me the other reviewers' comments afterwards as well, so I can see what they wrote. You said you don't do that in science because of confidentiality. Is it the author of the paper's confidentiality? I don't see their name. I see reviewer B said such and such.
I think the reason that we haven't done it yet is that we would need to redact the review so that its origin wasn't plain, and then we'd have to send it. We often notify reviewers what happened to the paper so they will know, but we have not sent copies of the other review. And to do that for the number of manuscripts that we deal with is something that I think we've hesitated primarily for the reasons of administrative cost. And I know it would be a good idea. Yes.
There's so much novel science, I'm sure, that gets sent your way. What exactly, or what generally constitutes, terrific for science versus terrific for a more specialized journal?
If there's a clear connection between this paper and other things that are happening, I don't mean at the same time in the same journal, but if it has significant impact not only for the subdiscipline but for others as well, that would be a strongly positive aspect. If it were an interesting interdisciplinary surprise. A paper we published that we considered at Space Meeting this morning, a meeting I join at 6:30 every Tuesday morning, is about a very sophisticated and interesting redating of a volcanic explosion in the Greek islands. If anyone has ever been to Santorini, that's the one. And there's been a little wobble about the date, but now somebody has found an olive tree buried in tephra, and they've been able to do some tree ring analysis and done a wiggle analysis of the carbon calendar, and now date that explosion differently by about 100 years. Well, that enforces a real recalculation about the coexistence of various civilizations, Minoan, Cretan, Egyptian, and it's so it has big sort of outreach. Now, it doesn't have to be that interesting in terms of outreach, but we will jump on papers that would do that kind of thing. Now, we're sometimes accused of jumping on papers because they'll get attention in the media. We like it when that happens, but we don't pick them for that. And some of our best papers are ones that never got attention in the media until maybe 3 or 4 years later, when it was necessary to correlate a whole bunch of new findings and suddenly realize that, wow, this was there all the time. Yeah.
I was speaking to a faculty member today, and he was telling me that he thought there was an overemphasis on the number of publications versus, getting a few key publications that really affect the direction of the field. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Oh, I'm for the influential minimum. Helen Waddell, the medieval scholar at Oxford, once said of a poet known only from a single poem. He was one of those traveling poets in medieval Europe, and is known only for this one poem. And Waddell said of him, and I can't remember it. Traveled light even into something. I'll think of it in the middle of the night and call you. Yeah, there are in my field, neuroscience, there were people in the most active period of the 60s and 70s who only published 3 or 4 papers, but they absolutely changed what everybody knew about synaptic connectivity. I'll try to do better with the next question. I sure hope there is one, because I don't want to end on that lame performance. Hi.
In terms of your editors, how do you choose who to be an editor of science and what the qualifications are?
Well, when we have a vacancy, and we've only lost 2 in a population of about 24. We've only lost 2 in the last 6 years. And we advertise ferociously for them in places where we think the people will notice. Of course, in our own journal, even in Nature, we go quickly to brand X for that purpose. And the Scientist and other Chronicle of Higher Education. Other places where people who might be candidates will likely see our opportunity, and then when we usually get a lot of applications, and when we narrow it down to 4 or 5 plausible people, we'll normally interview them on the fly as we see them as we're going there, or by telephone, and we'll invite 2 or 3 to come, and each one gives a seminar, and we have meetings with them. I mean, it's about the way Stanford would hire a new faculty member.
What about the associate editors?
Well, we have several ranks of editor, and some have more supervisory responsibilities than others. We have an executive editor. We have a deputy editor for physical sciences, a deputy editor for life sciences, and then a group of more senior editors. An example would be Barbara Jasny or Phil Zeromi in physical sciences, who have supervisory responsibilities and take some instructional responsibilities with respect to their young editors. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask about situation that you send a paper, you see something interesting, and they say, we will get it only when you will know the answers. And sometimes the answers can take 6, 7 years. And you're working till it's closed case. But I think that about the science, you need to say it and publish it even if you don't know the answers. And maybe somebody else in the other place in the globe know the answer.
Yeah.
Science is all about this, you know. You throw the ball and somebody pick it up and run till you throw it again.
Look, we have
Situation that people have info in their lab, they don't want to share it because it's secret until it will be published in Science or Cell. And if it's something that's connected with new drugs and things like this, people continue to die. And there is maybe info that's available and can make the process shortly.
Well, we frequently publish papers in which the mechanism of an action that's been experimentally verified and observed isn't quite clear. We will sometimes push the authors to do an additional experiment that might resolve a mechanism, but we will often publish without that. And we certainly don't think people should be keeping secrets. I mean, that's a problem of the ethics of the scholarly profession, not a problem we can solve.
I think that's going to be it for our question and answer session. And I'd like to remind you to fill out your surveys, as well as to remind you that next week we have a partner from MDS Capital, which is a company that has $2 billion in management. We'll have who is also a Ph.D. scientist from Duke, who has gotten into the world of banking and finance, will be sharing some explanations of how the two worlds come together. So with that, please